So welcome to today's deep dive. I'm your host, and today we're exploring something that I honestly think could completely shift how you view your own work.
And I am your resident expert for this deep dive. And yeah, I have to say, the stack of sources we're analyzing today, it's incredibly revealing stuff.
It really is. So to start us off, I want you, the listener, to just imagine a scene for a second. Imagine sitting out in this blinding, suffocating desert heat.
Oh yeah, sweating through your clothes.
Exactly. And you're surrounded by upwards of 2 million people. The dust is just swirling everywhere. The noise is absolutely
It's a
deafening.
chaotic environment.
Completely chaotic. And stretching out over the horizon is this line of thousands upon thousands of frustrated, anxious people, and they are all waiting for you.
Just you, no one else.
Right. Just you. Every single dispute, every logistical nightmare, every little conflict over resources, it all lands squarely on your shoulders.
Yeah.
You are entirely alone in this massive task.
And you are basically on the absolute verge of a catastrophic system-wide breakdown.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, that visceral scene isn't just like some hypothetical nightmare.
No, it's not. It was the absolute crushing reality for one of history's most famous leaders.
Right, and it perfectly illustrates this startling paradox that just jumps right out of the source material we're looking at today.
Yeah, the text frames the problem with this incredibly sharp observation. It says, basically, that leadership rarely fails because of a lack of passion.
Wow.
Right. Far more often, it fails because of a lack of structure.
I really want you, the listener, to hold on to that exact thought because, think about your own life for a second. Have you ever noticed how certain initiatives, maybe a massive project at your company or a grassroots community group you joined,
Or even a passionate nonprofit, right?
yes, how some of them just manage to grow their reach exponentially, while others, they just seem to grow in exhaustion?
Yeah, it's like, why do highly gifted, incredibly sincere, deeply passionate people suddenly just stall out?
They stall out, they grow bitter, and ultimately they just completely burn out.
Well, the standard cultural response is usually to diagnose that burnout as like a loss of willpower or a lack of heart. We just assume the fire faded.
Right, like they just stop caring.
Exactly. But the material we are unpacking today forces us to look completely past the heart. We have to examine the skeletal framework underneath it.
Because a burning passion without a skeletal structure will just collapse into a pile of ash.
That is exactly it. It just caves in on itself.
So that is our mission for today's deep dive. We are going to completely dismantle this myth that having a calling or a burning vision is somehow enough to sustain a mission.
It's just not enough. We're exploring a comprehensive guide on strategic leadership.
And we should clarify, the source material focuses pretty heavily on the context of ministry and spiritual leadership.
Right, it does. But the principles, the organizational psychology embedded in these texts, they echo way beyond that specific sphere.
Oh, absolutely. We're looking at the pure mechanics of translating a massive abstract vision into a sustainable day-to-day reality.
And the underlying why of this entire analysis is what makes it so compelling, honestly. The sources argue fiercely that order, structure, and management, they are not cold corporate intrusions.
Right. People always think management means you're acting like a sterile corporation.
Exactly. But the text presents them as deeply fundamental principles of preservation. They are like protective guardrails.
Guardrails that keep visionary leaders from being totally crushed under the immense weight of their own good intentions.
Yeah. So let's start with what the authors call the burden of a beautiful calling and this crisis of the lone leader.
Okay, let's unpack this. According to the text, almost every serious undertaking begins with this concept of holy fire.
Right, the holy fire. If we translate that into modern behavioral terms, it's basically the startup phase.
You have a thrilling vision, the immediate needs seem totally manageable, the adrenaline is just pumping.
Your energy feels absolutely endless in that phase. It's the honeymoon phase of leadership, basically driven by a massive dopamine rush.
But the source material points out this really brutal mathematical reality.
Yeah, early on, progress is rapid. But eventually, the complexities of the mission multiply exponentially, right? While the leader's personal capacity remains completely static.
Because you only have 24 hours in a day.
Exactly. The responsibilities start outpacing the leader's wisdom. The needs of the people grow vastly faster than the leader's available hours.
And then the fatigue sets in. The calling, which, once felt like this profound gift, it metamorphoses into this incredibly heavy, suffocating burden.
And the natural human reaction, especially in a spiritual or highly mission-driven context, is to internalize that fatigue as a moral failing.
Oh, man. The leader thinks, I must be doing something wrong. I just need to care more or work harder or just sleep less.
The text highlights that exact psychological trap. Leaders assume this exhaustion is a failure of their faith or like a lack of dedication. So what do? They double down.
They put in the 90-hour weeks.
Right. They try to carry even more of the emotional weight of their team, and they end up isolating themselves even further.
But the material makes this stark, really liberating correction. This is not a failure of faith. It is purely a failure of organization.
Which brings us right back to that guy sitting in the desert.
Yes. The source material uses the ancient story of Moses and his father-in-law, Jethro, from the book of Exodus, chapter 18. They use this as their primary case study.
And if anyone in history had a legitimate, undeniable calling, I mean, it was Moses.
Definitely. He confronted an empire. He led an entire population out of captivity. His moral authority was completely unquestioned.
He's presented as the ultimate anointed visionary, yet the text points us to this incredibly mundane, grueling scene.
Where Moses is sitting from morning until evening, acting as the sole judge and arbiter for every single complaint of an entire nation.
It's wild. He's acting as the mayor, the Supreme Court, the therapist, and the supply chain manager for 2 million people by himself.
It is mind-boggling organizational malpractice. I mean, he's trying to do the right thing. His intentions are totally pure.
But then his father-in-law, Jethro, visits the camp, and he observes this exhausting, wildly inefficient spectacle.
And he drops a massive truth bomb on him.
He really does. Jethro essentially says, what you are doing is not good. You and these people will surely wear yourselves out because this task is too heavy for you.
You cannot do it alone.
Right. And the brilliance of Jethro's intervention lies in what he completely ignores. He never questions Moses' spirituality.
That's such a key point. He doesn't interrogate his faith or his connection to the divine or his ultimate authority.
No, he looks at a spiritual leader and gives him an operational critique. Jethro diagnoses an acute organizational bottleneck.
Okay, I really want to unpack the psychology of overload you mentioned earlier, because I think a lot of listeners are sitting at their desks right now feeling exactly like Moses.
I guarantee many of them are.
When a leader is acting as the single point of failure for an entire organization, what is actually happening to their brain?
Well, when human beings are subjected to a constant barrage of high-stakes decisions without any buffering system, the brain's prefrontal cortex, which is the area responsible for complex planning and impulse control, it simply gets depleted.
Wow, so it's a physical depletion.
Yes. We call this decision fatigue. When responsibilities exceed cognitive capacity for long periods, the brain enters a state of chronic, low-grade fight or flight.
It's like a permanent state of triage.
Precisely that. When everything is treated as a 5-alarm fire, the brain completely loses the ability to prioritize effectively.
So you start answering trivial emails with the same urgency as a massive financial crisis.
Exactly. Decision-making degrades, patience evaporates, and the core motivation for the work just hollows out. The text emphasizes that humans are designed with hard limits.
Right, and ignoring those biological and cognitive limits doesn't make a leader a martyr. It makes them a liability to the mission.
It's dangerous.
It really makes me think of a smartphone. Imagine you have a phone that is trying to run 50 heavy, complex apps in the background simultaneously.
Okay, yeah.
It's tracking your GPS, playing a 4K video, downloading a massive file, running a graphics-heavy game all at once.
The phone would be incredibly hot to the touch.
Exactly. The screen starts freezing, the battery drains in like 20 minutes. But here's the thing. The phone itself isn't defective.
Right.
The battery isn't unfaithful to its purpose. The hardware is just experiencing a catastrophic system overload.
That's a great way to look at it.
To get the phone functioning properly again, you don't smash it and buy a new battery. You open the task manager and you shut down the background apps. You organize the processing power.
That is a phenomenal parallel. The smartphone's operating system requires a structured allocation of resources to function, just like a human leader requires an organizational framework to endure.
It's the exact same principle.
The source argues that strategic management becomes absolutely vital the exact moment a vision begins growing faster than the leader's personal, localized capacity to control it.
And Jethro's solution was to install that task manager. He told Moses to appoint capable leaders and divide them into a hierarchy.
Right, leaders over thousands, hundreds, 50s, and 10s.
He introduced layers of authority to filter the background noise, so Moses only had to handle the most complex, high-level processing.
But, I can hear a specific type of pushback forming, though. And the text acknowledges this, too.
Oh, for sure. There are a lot of deeply sincere people who view terms like management structures, hierarchies, and organizational charts as dirty words.
They really do. They feel like applying corporate efficiency models to a passionate spiritual calling is somehow a betrayal of the mission.
Yeah, they worry it turns a vibrant, living community into this sterile, bureaucratic machine.
The assumption there is that spontaneity is the ultimate proof of authenticity. There is this deep-seated fear that planning suffocates inspiration.
That creating an orderly system somehow replaces a reliance on organic, dynamic growth.
But the source material attacks this premise head-on. It takes us into what it calls the theology of order, arguing that structure isn't a human invention at all.
Yeah, the authors trace this all the way back to the very first page of their central text, Genesis chapter 1.
They point out that the creation narrative is fundamentally a story of divine order being imposed on chaos.
The text observes that the universe isn't described as being created in one chaotic, haphazard explosion.
No, Genesis describes the initial state as formless and void, and then a systematic process begins.
Light is separated from darkness. Land is separated from sea. Flora and fauna are categorized according to their kinds. Days and seasons are established.
The overarching argument the authors are making here is that order, categorization, and boundaries reflect the foundational nature of reality.
That's wild. And they also point to the construction of the tabernacle in Exodus. I remember reading those chapters, and the level of granular architectural detail is almost overwhelming.
Oh, it's incredibly precise.
You have exact measurements in cubits for the curtains, highly specific material requirements like acacia wood and bronze color palettes, and intensely defined job descriptions for the priests. Why would a text focused on spiritual connection spend so much time sounding like an IKEA instruction manual?
What's fascinating here is that the source material posits that order prepares the environment for the intended outcome.
Okay, tell me more about that.
The extreme detail wasn't about bureaucratic red tape. It was about formatting a physical space to safely house something incredibly powerful.
Ah, I see.
It taught the community that engaging with their core mission required reverence, intentionality, and careful preparation. The text frames this not as rigid legalism, but as necessary formation.
There is a quote from the New Testament that the text leans on heavily here from the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 14:33. He writes, God is not the author of confusion, but of peace.
Yes.
The source draws a straight, unbroken line between the presence of peace and the implementation of structural order.
And this is where the authors redefine the very concept of structure. They make the provocative claim that in a leadership context, order is fundamentally an expression of love.
I have to admit, I'm struggling with the idea that structure is love. To me, structure often feels restrictive.
A lot of people feel that way.
It feels like rules, red tape, and being told what to do. If I join a passionate volunteer group, I want to feel the energy, not read a standard operating procedure manual. How do the sources justify calling that love?
Consider the inverse scenario. A disorganized initiative might have an abundance of raw energy, right? But energy without a container becomes destructive.
Give me an example.
Well, say you are running a food bank and you have no structure, no delivery schedules, no inventory tracking, no assigned roles. What happens?
It'd be a mess.
Volunteers show up, they don't know what to do, and they feel their time is completely wasted. The food rots because no one knew it was delivered.
Oh, that's awful.
And the vulnerable people you are trying to feed end up going hungry because the chaotic system failed them. The text argues that love seeks the ultimate good of another person. Therefore, building a structure that respects a volunteer's time, clarifies expectations, and ensures the mission actually reaches the people who need it, that is a profound, tangible act of love.
Wow. That reframes it completely.
Mm-hmm.
Good organization isn't about the leader trying to control people. It's about the leader trying to protect people from the collateral damage of chaos.
Exact.
That makes me think of a river. The banks of a river aren't there to stop the water.
Right.
The banks create a safe, directed framework where the water, the energy, the passion can flow powerfully toward a destination. If you remove the banks, you don't get a better river. You get a flood that destroys the very towns it was supposed to nourish.
The structure provides the necessary friction for the energy to become useful power.
But wait, what about adaptability? Doesn't a rigid structure box you in?
How so?
Well, if you have this massive 5-year strategic plan, aren't you terrified of missing out on a sudden, spontaneous opportunity because it wasn't on the spreadsheet?
The sources address that exact tension. They argue that creating a plan is an act of stewardship. It acknowledges that time and human resources are finite and valuable.
Okay.
However, the text warns against the arrogance of inflexible planning. The functional posture the authors recommend is this: plan boldly, hold loosely, obey quickly.
Oh, I like that.
You build the riverbanks, but you remain entirely willing to divert the water if the terrain shifts.
Plan boldly, hold loosely, obey quickly.
I love that.
Framework. So if we accept that intentional design is necessary and that building an orderly system is an act of love towards your team, we run into the massive practical hurdle.
Rejects.
How does a leader actually do it? How do you take a soaring emotional vision and bolt it down to the ground as a functional strategy?
This is the critical gap between having a calling and making an impact. Vision is simply the revelation of the desired future state. It tells you what needs to happen. Strategy is the architectural blueprint. It dictates how that future state will be achieved through daily methodical obedience. A vision without a strategy is nothing more than emotional entertainment.
To illustrate this blueprinting process, the text points us to the historical figure of Nehemiah.
Yeah, that's a great case study.
When Nehemiah receives word that the walls of Jerusalem have been destroyed and the city is defenseless, his initial reaction is intensely emotional and spiritual.
He weeps, he fasts, and he prays for days.
But the defining characteristic of his leadership is that he doesn't stay on his knees.
His prayer acts as the catalyst for immediate strategic planning.
The source details his methodical approach. He doesn't just ride into the city and start shouting inspirational slogans.
Right, he conducts a secret nocturnal audit of the physical damage to understand the real scope of the problem.
He leverages his political connections to secure lumber and safe passage. But his true genius lies in his delegation strategy.
Absolutely. Let's look at the sociological mechanics of what Nehemiah actually did, because it's brilliant. He didn't just hire a massive general contractor to build the wall.
No, the text shows he divided the massive perimeter into distinct sections. And he assigned specific families to rebuild the section of the wall that was literally right in front of their own houses.
Think about the psychological leverage of that decision. He localized the accountability.
Yeah, if you are responsible for the structural integrity of the wall that directly protects your own children sleeping inside, are you going to cut corners on the mortar?
Are you going to leave a vulnerability? Absolutely not.
He took a massive, abstract vision, rebuilt the defenses of Jerusalem, and translated it into an intensely personal, granular motivation. Protect your own living room.
He gave them skin in the game.
And he also foresaw the operational friction. He knew they would face opposition, so he balanced the labor force.
He organized them so that half the people were actively building with trowels while the other half stood guard with spears, and they rotated.
Because he combined a burning vision with an airtight, psychologically astute strategy, a massive infrastructure project was completed in just 52 days.
It's incredible. And the material reinforces this need for intentionality by looking at the life of Jesus, too.
Right.
The cultural picture of a spiritual teacher is often someone who just wanders aimlessly, dispensing wisdom to whoever happens to be walking by. But the text argues that Jesus operated with severe strategic intentionality.
The sources point to the feeding of the 5,000. You have a massive hungry crowd in an isolated area. It is a logistical nightmare waiting to happen.
Completely.
Before any food is distributed, Jesus doesn't just start tossing loaves into the mob. He commands the disciples to organize the crowd, having them sit down in specific groups of 50s and 100s.
Consider the crowd control dynamics at play there. If you just introduce a scarce resource into a massive, disorganized crowd, human nature dictates that the strongest, most aggressive people will push to the front.
And they'll take more than their share.
Right, while the vulnerable, the children, the elderly, will be trampled and go hungry.
Wow, yeah.
By forcing the crowd into manageable, observable grids, Jesus ensured equitable distribution. The extraordinary provision worked entirely through the mechanism of human arrangement.
The authors also point out how Jesus structured his team. He didn't just have an amorphous following. He deliberately selected a core group of 12.
And later, when he expands the mission, he sends out a group of 70. But he doesn't send them out as isolated individuals to maximize geographic coverage.
It sends them out in pairs.
Sending them in pairs is a fascinating strategic choice. It introduces immediate psychological safety, mutual support in hostile environments, and a built-in accountability framework.
If one becomes exhausted or discouraged, the other provides perspective.
Exactly. The strategy mitigated the exact kind of isolation-induced burnout that Moses experienced in the desert.
The text highlights a major operational danger for leaders who refuse to build these strategic frameworks. They call it the urgency trap.
Which essentially traps an organization in a cycle of reactive ministry.
What does that look like day to day?
Reactive leadership means spending all of your finite energy putting out preventable fires instead of fireproofing the building.
Oof.
When you lack a strategy, every incoming request feels equally important. The leader becomes a slave to the squeaky wheel, constantly responding to the loudest immediate problem, but never actually advancing the long-term mission.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I want to return to that Lego metaphor we touched on earlier because it perfectly encapsulates this frustration.
Go for it.
Having a powerful vision is like looking at the beautiful, glossy picture of a completed castle on the front of a Lego box.
Right, it thrills you. It shows you what is possible.
But if you just tear open the box, dump 1,000 plastic blocks onto the living room floor, and throw away the step-by-step instruction manual, you aren't going to build a castle.
No, you are going to end up with a chaotic, unidentifiable pile of plastic.
And worse, when you try to walk through that room in the dark, you are going to step on a rogue Lego block, and it is going to cause immense pain.
That is exactly how well-meaning volunteers feel when they join a disorganized mission.
They're stepping barefoot onto the chaotic, painful blocks of a vision that the leader never bothered to structure. A vision without an instruction manual just causes collateral damage.
That's spot on. So we have the vision, and we understand the vital need for a strategic blueprint. But the architect cannot lay every single brick alone.
True.
To actually execute this strategy, the leader has to confront what the source material implies is the ultimate excruciating test of leadership maturity. They have to willingly give away their power.
This initiates the discussion on the spiritual discipline of delegation. And it's crucial to note how the sources frame this.
They do not present delegation merely as a corporate time management hack so the leader can play golf on Fridays.
Right. They elevate delegation to a deeply spiritual act of humility and relational trust.
We circle back here to Moses and that structural hierarchy Jethro forced him to build. The text is very clear about the severe consequences of refusing to delegate.
It isn't just about the leader's personal fatigue. If you refuse to distribute responsibility, you create a massive organizational bottleneck, effectively capping the growth of the mission at the limit of your own personal energy.
The sources go deeper, highlighting what they call the crisis of one-man leadership. They point out the subtle, insidious arrogance hidden within a refusal to delegate.
Oh, this part hit hard.
When a leader says, I can't hand this over because if I don't do it myself, it won't get done right, they are masking unchecked pride as servant leadership.
Wow.
The refusal to delegate subtly broadcasts the toxic belief that the success of the entire endeavor relies entirely on one human being's perfection.
So genuine delegation is a public confession that the mission is larger than the leader.
Exactly. The text breaks effective delegation down into an interconnected triad: trust, authority, and accountability. If any one of those three legs is missing, the stool collapses.
Let's dissect the failure modes of that triad.
Well, if you give someone a task, let's say you name them the event coordinator, but you do not transfer the actual authority to execute the task, such as giving them access to the budget or the power to sign vendor contracts, you haven't delegated.
Right, because they have all the responsibility but none of the leverage.
You have merely created a scapegoat whom you are now micromanaging.
Yeah.
Conversely, if you transfer massive authority but implement zero accountability metrics, you invite vision drift, financial mismanagement, and chaos.
So you must establish the parameters of success, provide the necessary authority, and then trust them to navigate the space between.
Precisely.
If delegation is the obvious necessary mechanism for scaling any mission, and the consequences of hoarding control are so universally disastrous, why do so many incredibly smart, capable, passionate people absolutely hate doing it?
It's a great question. Why is it so hard to let go?
The author suggests several psychological barriers. The first is the visceral fear of losing control over the brand or the outcome.
Yeah, the perfectionist's dilemma.
Exactly. It's the agonizing realization that the person you delegate to will likely only do the job 80% as well as you would have done it, at least initially. You have to mourn the loss of your own idealized standard in exchange for sustainable growth.
And there is also a third reason the text hints at, which is a bit uncomfortable to admit. Sometimes leaders subconsciously hoard tasks because they desperately want to feel indispensable.
Oh, right.
If I'm the only one who knows how to run the soundboard, fix the database, or calm down the angry client, then I am safe, I am needed. It feeds the ego.
To combat that ego, the source material points to the Apostle Paul's metaphor in 1 Corinthians 12, where he compares a community to a physical body.
The authors translate this ancient metaphor into modern organizational theory, cognitive diversity, and distributed processing.
Right. By hoarding all the critical functions, a leader is actively stunting the growth of their own team.
They are preventing other people from discovering, exercising, and refining their own latent abilities. The hand shouldn't try to perform the function of the eye.
By doing everything for everyone, you aren't serving them. You're keeping them immature.
That's a powerful way to put it.
Okay, so if a leader accepts that they must distribute responsibility, the immediate next hurdle is figuring out exactly who gets the keys to the car. How do you identify the right people, and how do you transition them from being passive task doers into autonomous, ownership-taking leaders?
The source material addresses this in a dedicated section on building people, and it draws an absolute non-negotiable hard line when it comes to recruitment.
Character must always supersede talent.
Always. The authors use an incredible case study from Acts chapter 6 to prove this point.
Oh, I remember this one.
The early movement was growing rapidly, and they hit a severe logistical snag. A specific demographic, certain widows were being marginalized and overlooked in the daily distribution of food.
It was an escalating crisis that threatened to fracture the community.
Right. The core leaders, the apostles, realized they could not personally manage the supply chain issue without abandoning their primary focus. So they needed to delegate this massive administrative undertaking.
But look at the criteria they established for the hiring process. They didn't tell the community to find 7 men with degrees in logistics or experience in supply chain management or culinary expertise.
The text states they required 7 men full of the Spirit and wisdom. They demanded people of impeccable reputation.
Why require such a high standard of spiritual and ethical integrity just to hand out rations of bread?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, managing a supply chain involving vulnerable populations and shared resources requires profound integrity.
I see.
If you put a highly efficient but morally compromised person in charge of food distribution, you introduce bias, embezzlement, and corruption.
That makes total sense.
The technical skills required to organize the food could be taught on the job, but the character required to distribute it fairly without taking bribes or playing favorites had to be foundational.
The text also draws a sharp distinction between recruiting workers and developing leaders. It references a phrase from Ephesians chapter 4, equipping the saints, which the authors translate as transitioning your workforce.
What is the functional difference between a worker and a leader in this context?
The source explains that workers execute assigned tasks, while leaders multiply the overarching mission.
Give me an example of that.
Well, a worker will dutifully stand at the table and hand out the bread until the shift is over.
Okay.
A leader will analyze the demographic data, realize why the widows were being missed in the first place, build a new delivery system to ensure it never happens again, and then recruit and train 3 new workers to run that system.
That is a huge difference. To cultivate that level of leadership, the text stresses the absolute necessity of collaborative counsel, citing Proverbs again. A secure leader surrounds themselves with people who possess differing strengths and perspectives.
That emphasis on character over talent makes me think of a hospital scenario.
Okay, lay it on me.
Imagine you have a complex illness and require life-saving surgery. You do your research and find the most brilliant, technically gifted surgeon on the planet. Their dexterity is legendary. Their success rate is off the charts.
Sounds like the person you want.
Right. But then you find out this surgeon fundamentally refuses to wash their hands before operating. They don't believe in the discipline of sterilization. Would you let them cut you open?
Absolutely not. The risk of systemic infection completely negates the value of their surgical precision.
Exactly. The unwashed hands represent a critical flaw in character and integrity. The foundation of the operating room has to be clean before the technical skill is applied.
A highly charismatic, incredibly skilled leader who lacks fundamental integrity is an unsterilized scalpel.
Yes. They might execute the immediate task brilliantly, but they will leave a trail of hidden infections that will eventually kill the organizational body.
Wow. But a faithful person of high character, however, can always be sent to medical school to learn the surgical skills.
The sources reinforce this by looking at how Jesus constructed his own executive team. He systematically chose potential over perfection.
He bypassed the highly educated, polished religious elites of his day and recruited blue-collar workers, fishermen, and despised tax collectors.
He utilized an experiential training model. He taught them, sent them out to try it, let them fail, and then analyze the failure with them.
Which brings us to a very real, very uncomfortable reality that every leader has to face.
What's that?
When you empower people, even people of incredibly good character, they are still human. They are going to drop the ball. What happens when the person you delegated a critical task to makes a massive public mistake?
The source material dives deep into the tension between maintaining authority and relinquishing control. It argues that true leadership is fundamentally about influence, not forensic micromanagement.
When you truly delegate, you must accept that mistakes are not just a possibility, they are an absolute inevitability.
And human nature, especially for a visionary founder, is to immediately swoop in, fix the error, publicly dress down the person who made it, and vow to never give them responsibility again.
It's the reflex to reclaim control.
Exactly. So how does the framework in our sources suggest a leader should process failure?
The text presents an approach that views honest mistakes as vital, data-rich opportunities for development, rather than capital offenses requiring immediate termination.
The ultimate model they point to is the story of Jesus restoring the Apostle Peter, found in John chapter 21.
We need to contextualize what Peter did because he didn't just forget to file a report.
No, not at all.
During the most critical, high-stakes moment of the entire narrative, the trial and execution of Jesus, Peter publicly and vehemently denied even knowing him.
It was an apocalyptic failure of courage, loyalty, and leadership.
It was a total collapse of character under pressure. Yet, the text focuses on the aftermath. When Jesus interacts with Peter post-resurrection, he doesn't crush him.
He doesn't strip him of his rank or replace him.
Right, he walks him through a restorative process. He separates the failure of the moment from Peter's core identity and his future potential.
The source authors warn that a leader who consistently crushes their team for making errors is broadcasting fear-driven control, not strength.
True leadership guides, corrects, and restores. The text discusses the necessity of creating an organizational culture of safe failure.
Establishing a culture of safe failure means building an environment where experimental and learning errors are expected, reported quickly, and analyzed without fear of retribution.
However, the text makes a crucial defining distinction. A leader must differentiate between a learning error, a mistake made while attempting to execute the mission in good faith, and intentional negligence, malice, or an ethical breach.
Grace is applied to the former. Strict discipline is applied to the latter.
But I have to push back on this concept of safe failure, and I'm certain many listeners are skeptical too.
Okay, what's the pushback?
If a leader is constantly buffering their team from the consequences of their mistakes under the banner of grace and restoration, doesn't that inherently lower the standard of excellence for the entire organization?
It's a fair question.
Doesn't grace just become a spiritualized excuse for accepting sloppy, mediocre work?
That is the perpetual danger. And the source material clarifies the distinction beautifully. Extending grace does not equate to lowering the standard. It means utilizing the failure as a pedagogical tool.
It is about the true nature of accountability.
How does accountability fit into a culture of grace?
You hold the standard of excellence ruthlessly high. But when a team member inevitably falls short of that standard, you use the gap between their performance and the standard as a diagnostic tool for their development, rather than a guillotine for their employment.
Accountability is reframed from being a mechanism of punitive mistrust into a mechanism of developmental care.
It ensures the person is supported, the root cause of the error is identified, and their progress can be objectively measured moving forward.
It's a callback to the Lego metaphor. If a team member builds a section of the Lego castle incorrectly, you don't scream at them and throw the entire Lego set into the incinerator. But you also don't just leave the mismatched, structurally unsound pieces in the wall and pretend it looks fine.
You sit down with them, you pull out the instruction manual, you disassemble the flawed section together, and you teach them how to rebuild it correctly so the wall holds weight.
Exactly. You address the error meticulously, but you preserve the builder.
So if we are setting strategic goals, structuring our resources, delegating vital tasks, and allowing our teams the psychological safety to grow through their mistakes, we arrive at the final, overarching question of the deep dive.
How do we ultimately evaluate if this entire complex system is actually working? How do we measure success?
This raises an important question, and it leads us to the final major theme of the text: the agonizing difficulty of measuring fruit without losing faith.
The sources identify a profound, persistent tension in leadership. There is a constant gravitational pull to measure success exclusively through numerical, empirical data.
Spreadsheets, quarterly profits, attendance figures, or social media metrics.
The text contrasts this with the concept of measuring spiritual and organizational faithfulness, leaning heavily on the metaphor in John 15 of branches abiding in a vine.
The allure of the spreadsheet is that it is objective. It is incredibly easy to count the number of people in an auditorium or the dollars in a bank account.
It is agonizingly difficult to measure a shift in a community's culture, the resolution of a deep-seated conflict, or the internal character transformation of a team member.
And because it is difficult, leaders often default to measuring what is easy, which completely skews the entire objective of the organization.
The text quotes 1 Corinthians 3, where Paul uses an agricultural metaphor. One person plants the seed, another waters it, but God gives the growth.
The authors extract a vital organizational principle from this. A leader must separate inputs from outputs.
Meaning what, practically?
Meaning, the leader's primary responsibility is not to manufacture the growth, which is often outside their direct control due to market forces, cultural shifts, or human free will.
The leader's job is to faithfully, consistently manage the inputs.
Are we planting the right seeds? Are we watering them through healthy structures? Are we cultivating the soil of our team's culture?
But the material doesn't swing to the opposite extreme and say, numbers are evil, don't measure anything, just vibe. It advocates for a balanced dashboard, defining 3 distinct metrics of success.
Spiritual, operational, and relational.
Right. The dashboard needs multiple dials. The operational metric is the easiest to grasp. Did we execute the strategy? Did we complete the project on budget? Did Nehemiah actually finish the wall?
And the spiritual metric, or the core values metric, looks for evidence of alignment with the mission's foundational ethics.
Are people demonstrating integrity, resilience, and ethical obedience, even when it costs them numerically?
And the third dial, the relational metric, is fascinating. How do you measure relational health in an organization?
You measure it by analyzing the friction. How does the team handle conflict? Is there a high turnover rate among volunteers?
Are people operating in silos, or is there cross-departmental collaboration? Are we leaving a wake of burned-out, cynical former employees, or are people growing healthier by being associated with us?
That is a diagnostic that cuts deep. The authors issue a severe warning here regarding the danger of human ambition masquerading as spiritual or mission-driven goals.
It is so easy to desperately want to build a massive empire to satisfy your own ego, but to brand that desire as wanting to reach more people for the cause.
The text forces leaders to look at the timeline of their ambition. Are you obsessing over short-term visible crowd sizes, or are you investing in long-term multiplication?
It brings us right back to the methodology of Jesus as the ultimate counterintuitive example.
He had the opportunity to build a massive, centralized, immediate kingdom. Thousands were flocking to him.
But he routinely walked away from the massive crowds to invest deeply, patiently, and structurally into just 12 incredibly flawed men.
If you looked at his ministry on a corporate spreadsheet at the end of his life, the numbers would look abysmal. A handful of followers, 0 real estate, 0 financial endowments.
Numerically, it appears to be a failure of scale. But the relational and spiritual fruit of that deep, highly structured, localized investment eventually catalyzed a movement that altered the trajectory of human history.
The authors conclude that operational goals must honor the integrity of the design, but the ultimate scale of the outcomes must be relinquished.
That requires a profound psychological shift.
So what does this all mean? It challenges you, the listener, to audit your own internal scorecard.
Are you measuring your worth as a leader solely by the immediate, visible harvest?
Are you panicking because the numbers dipped this quarter? Or are you measuring your success by your dogged faithfulness to the structure, the ethical process, and the deliberate development of the people you have been entrusted to lead?
It demands a transition from the frantic mindset of a performer trying to earn applause to the grounded mindset of a steward.
A steward recognizes that they do not own the estate. They are simply tasked with faithfully managing the resources, the energy, and the personnel that have been placed in their care for a limited time.
Let's pull all of these threads together and briefly recap the incredible journey we've taken through these sources today.
We started by diagnosing the pain of the lone leader, realizing that raw passion must be paired with an organizational skeleton, otherwise it collapses into burnout.
We explored the theology of order, discovering that from the dawn of creation to the blueprint of the tabernacle, intentional design is a reflection of the divine, and structure is fundamentally an act of love that protects the vulnerable.
We examined how a soaring vision is utterly useless without the granular mechanics of a strategy, looking at Nehemiah dividing the wall and Jesus organizing the crowds.
We unpack the absolute necessity of delegation, recognizing it not as a time saver, but as a profound act of humility that requires trust, authority, and accountability.
We discuss the imperative of recruiting for character over talent, because an unwashed scalpel is a danger to the patient.
We navigated the difficult terrain of safe failure, learning that grace is not the lowering of standards, but the use of mistakes as developmental tools.
And finally, we redefined how to measure success, moving away from the tyranny of the spreadsheet toward a holistic evaluation of our faithfulness to the inputs.
And the relevance of this material to your daily life cannot be overstated. You do not need to be the CEO of a multinational corporation or the head of a massive nonprofit to apply this.
Whether you are managing a small department at work, organizing a neighborhood initiative, or simply trying to bring some semblance of peace and order to the chaotic schedule of your own household, these principles are universal.
Shared burdens and structured love are the mechanisms of human flourishing.
As we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, building on everything we've uncovered in the text today.
Take a hard, honest look at the thing you are pouring your life into right now.
If your leadership, your project, or your family's functioning relies entirely on your constant physical presence and your micromanagement to succeed,
If the entire apparatus would grind to a halt the second you stepped away.
you haven't actually built a sustainable mission. You have merely built a monument to your own indispensability. Ask yourself the terrifying question: what would actually happen to your work if you had to disappear for a full year?
It is the ultimate litmus test of a leader's legacy. We are called to build systems that survive our absence.
Start building that structure today. Build the framework that will allow your vision to outlive your energy. Because remember, you do not want to be the smartphone trying to run 50 complex apps in the background until the battery critically fails and the screen goes dark. Stop trying to carry it all. Open the task manager, shut down the background noise, build a sustainable system, and let the real, enduring work finally begin.